dog does not bark all through our conversation. She's promised to take care of that.
You know, we are fond of dogs here on The Blaze. So if your mom's dog barks during the conversation, that is okay. We just consider that punctuation. Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I'm Jenna Blum. I'm one of the co-founders of The Blaze. And today I'm here with Jean Hanff Korelitz. Hello, Jean. Welcome.
Yeah.
So excited to have you. I'm going to tear into your bio and your newest book in a moment. But first, a little commercial for The Blaze. If you are a repeat Blazer, welcome back. Thanks for bringing your light to The Blaze. If you are new here, we are a team of approximately 30-ish creative volunteers. We are dedicated to helping writers reach their readers in the age of COVID and now obviously far beyond. If you like, I know, right? Bye, COVID. See ya. If you like what you see here, give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Blue Sky, because we over there now, because we are ubiquitous. And please consider signing up for our newsletter at www.amightyblaze.com so you never have literary FOMO ever again. No more FOMO. Nobody likes that. Oh, also we're on TikTok. And I just showed my age by not being like, TikTok, go to TikTok. Whatever, we're also on TikTok where we have an amazing new Blaze director. And now I'm going to introduce Jean in case you have lived under a literary rock for many decades and have not heard of her. So you ready for your bio, Jean?
I'm afraid. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, it's from your own book jacket. So nothing to, unless you haven't read that for a while. Yeah, Jean Hanff Korelitz is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels The Plot, and which is showcased so beautifully behind her on the mantle, and The Latecomer, and the sequel, which we are here to talk about today. Both The Plot and The Latecomer are being adapted as limited series. You Should Have Known, which aired on HBO as The Undoing, which I was obsessed with, both book and, I mean, I could just do a whole show on like the book and the show, and Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman and the adaptation. And Admission, which was adapted into a film starring Tina Fey, Devil and Webster, The White Rose, The Sabbath Day River, and A Jury of Her Peers, as well as Interference Powder, a novel for children. Jean's company, Book the Writer. Are you still doing Book the Writer, one hopes, yes?
We just had Julia Phillips a few days ago.
Oh, amazing. It's hard to imagine when you sleep. But Book the Writer, in case you don't know about this, not much, hosts pop-up book groups in which small groups of authors discuss new books with their authors. We love this here on Blaze. And Jean lives in New York with her husband, the Irish poet Paul Muldoon, whom she is now producing a play with as well. That's in its 4th year. So I will be asking about that as well. But welcome again.
Thank you, Jenna. And, you know, just the way when you introduced the Blaze, I remembered, I was like back in my head to the spring of 2020 when, you know, as we all know, bad things were happening. And yet there was this real bubbling up of creativity. And there were so many things that year that people kind of jumped into the void to entertain us, to sustain us. And we were all learning to use Zoom at the same time. It was as if there was a global lesson going on. And I really appreciate what you did. At one point, I wrote this Instagram post about the COVID MVPs as far as I was concerned. And I'm almost certain I have the Mighty Blaze on there because, you know, along with the people doing free dance classes online and, you know, bake club and all sorts of cool stuff that was happening.
Thank you. Of course, I'm going to go back and look for that. Thank you, just to verify. But
I hope I did, but if I didn't, I certainly feel that way.
I'm sure you did. And you should just be grateful that we never did a Blaze dance class, because that would have been a really ugly flash mob. Not so good. We talk about books here. We don't do so much dancing, but I'm so excited to talk to you about the kind of, I want to talk about the sequel, but I also want to talk about, why do I keep holding it like this? The plot. Because I am obsessed with these books. You guys, you should buy these books as a bundle. Every bookstore should be selling them as a bundle. But I want to talk about the sequel as independent from the plot, which is a challenge because it is a sequel. So can you describe the sequel for us? What is the basic plot of the sequel? Like how meta that is.
Yeah, the whole thing is so meta. it's so meta that the actual chapter titles in the sequel are the titles of sequels. So that's a little factoid nobody needed, but was a whole lot of fun. I did not imagine that I would be writing a sequel to The Plot. I've never written a sequel, unless you count my novel, The Devil and Webster, which was technically a revisiting of a character who had been the protagonist of my earlier novel, The Sabate River, but nobody read The Sabate River. So I didn't really stress about it. I think I got one communication from a reader saying, isn't this the same character? But really it was a de facto standalone because nobody had read the first one. But about a year or two had passed before, after publishing The Plot, and I was doing some menial task, and the idea just popped into my head that I wanted to know what happened next to this character. This is a character who only really comes into focus towards the end of The Plot. They're an important character, but we don't really know them very well until the final pages of The Plot. And they are a very, very interesting character. And I see I'm being very, very circumspect here, but I just thought, wow, there's so much more to say.
That's great. Can I say the pronoun of this character? I promise I won't give away any spoilers.
It's up to you, sure.
I don't want to spoil it. And again, like, I think you can read the sequel as a standalone, because the things that I loved about The Plot, I also loved about the sequel, the same sort of perspicacity and the sharpness and the smart humor applied to the publishing industry.
I think we can call it snark and bitchiness too. It's okay with me.
You said it. I haven't thought it, but I mean, I think those things in the best possible way. I mean, it is like wonderfully snarky about the publishing industry. Both books are, and both of them, I will say, acted as a sort of shot of the heroine to me as a writer, which I will explain later. I mean this in the best possible way, but I feel as though yes, but like writing about writers and writing about this industry that we both occupy, and all of us watching and listening occupy because we love books. It was just such a joy, and like, you are just so freaking smart and so freaking funny and so deadpan about it, and so I could gobble that up for days, or inject it for days, basically. So we could basically talk about both books without discussing the plot of either book at all.
Just publishing stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so let me do this without the pronoun then. The character who dismounts at the end of The Plot, who is the antagonist and the sort of antihero of the sequel. Did that person, you said the book kind of came into your head, did that person kind of stalk you and demand that the story be told? Like, how did this happen?
No, I've never had that experience that I know other writers talk about, where the character hounds them and stands behind them and speaks in their ear. And I'm fascinated by that, but that's never happened to me. No, it was just, the character left me with so much curiosity about how they got the way they did. I'm interested in liars. I've always been interested in liars. My books tend to be quite different from one another, but when you line them all up and you look at them like a anthropologist, you do see the little spiky bits that stick out. And it is clear, for example, that I love to write about academia. I often set my books on college campuses. I have been a faculty spouse for 35 years at Princeton, and I've gotten to see 2 generations of students come through, and they're fascinating. It's wonderful to write about universities as places where people talk about ideas, because that's interesting to me. But even more than that, I am clearly fascinated by liars. I don't think there's been a novel I've written that does not feature some spectacular liar. I myself am not a very good liar. I won't say I've never done it, but I don't like doing it. It feels awful to me. And I have never outgrown my fascination with people who just lie and then go on to their next activity. So these are the characters that I tend to gravitate towards. And some of the books that you mentioned, the one that became The Undoing, for example, all about a liar. Other lies are less venal. They're lies, they're sins of omission, but they're not done out of any cruelty. I would call the latecomer something in that category. So this is what I like to write about, and this person that I wrote the sequel about is one of the greatest liars I've ever written about. Everything is a lie, and that's kind of catnip.
I love that. You actually are pre-guessing all of my questions. I was going to ask about the Easter eggs of the titles in this book, which are themselves all sequels. And there's a list in the book of the original and the sequels that the titles are based on. And I want to follow up on that. But I also was thinking, being a scholar of your oeuvre, that I was like, what is the through line here between the books that I would categorize as the suspense, the thrillers, and then the books that are not written with that as their intent? And I was thinking dark psychology, if one can say that. Like, you are obviously fascinated with people doing bad things and like really going there. And I had not thought about the fact that the people are liars, and sometimes they're catastrophic liars, as in the sequel, as in the plot, as in You Should Have Known, which is I've read that book many times. And why liars? Why is lying so fascinating? Because you don't do it except to be a fiction writer?
Because my default position is not to do it. In the Proust questionnaire that appears at the back of Vanity Fair every year, every month, one of the questions is, when do you lie? Which is a fascinating question. And for many of the people answering the questionnaire, they say something like, when I go backstage after a show, or when somebody says, how does this dress look on me? Or this is not really lying. This is trying to do no harm in the world, trying to leave things not worse than you found them. Lying to somebody about the play that you just spent 3 horrific hours watching because you knew you had to go backstage and greet your friend, the main actor. That is not a lie. That is, that is palliative care, basically. So, but then there are people who lie because they can, because it doesn't harm them, because they benefit from it, because it's fun for them, because their purpose on earth is to bring harm into the world. And these are the people who we're watching right now, they are teaching us all these unpleasant lessons again. And I'm fascinated. I'm a little tired at the moment, but I'm still fascinated with how they behave in the world. Yeah.
Do you think it is something that starts out as a character trait and becomes a habit, or is it a habit that starts with one lie and then snowballs once they get away with it? I mean, your people lie because, well, in the plot, the main character lies because he has ambition and he can't fulfill it any other way. But I would say in the sequel, the anti-hero of this book lies to, I'm trying to think. I didn't really think about the motivation here, but the anti-hero lies as a sort of vacuity of character, and the same thing is true for You Should Have Known.
Yeah, true. All right. So first of all, I'm gonna unburden us both by revealing the gender of that, because the novel, the sequel is about a woman named Anna Williams Bonner. She is the widow of the protagonist of the plot. First of all, the answer to those questions will not come from me, because I think you're far more likely to get them, if you're going to get them at all, from a psychology PhD or a therapist who's been in practice their whole life, not from the likes of myself. But I will say that if you had Anna on a couch in a shrink's office and you asked her that question, she would say, all I have ever wanted is to be left alone. And it is true that of the great harm she's caused and continues to cause in her life, nothing is initiated. In other words, she does not initiate harm. She doesn't pick out somebody walking down the street and says, I think I'm going to take out that person. She doesn't even get angry at somebody and go after them. She harms out of perceived self-preservation after having been, in her view, assaulted first. So, I mean, this is to be left alone in life is it's an instinct that so many of us can be sympathetic towards. I always think of, Greta Garbo wandering the streets of New York and just saying, just leave me alone. I don't want you coming up to me. I don't want to hear about your life. Just leave me alone. And that is all this character has ever wanted. And that is her motivation.
Really interesting. And I would think that's what she thinks she wants, and yet sort of does, like, there's one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. When you create these characters who are malevolent or inadvertently malevolent in their actions, do you do the psychological research? Do you talk to those psychology PhDs or the therapists, or do you just kind of follow them through their webs?
Well, I mean, I was raised by a therapist, so I got it at the dinner table.
Yeah.
My mother was a therapist for, many decades, and she had a special fascination with sociopaths, which is why, the murderous doctor in You Should Have Known was a character probably, born at the dinner table when I was a kid. But in terms of this person, I mean, this person is not just stirring shit. I mean, this is a very, very dangerous person. So somebody you really just do not want to get on the wrong side of. Thankfully, I don't know anyone like that. And I'm very happy to tell you all that I am not like that myself.
You don't think you know anybody like that. But if you did, you would never know.
Well, I mean, there would be a body count around them, I think.
That is true.
I mean, certainly, we meet people and something just says, don't invest in this relationship, go in the other direction. And if we're not idiots, which often we are, we obey that instinct. And we may not really know what it is about this person, but, we might notice that they don't have close friends, that they're not on speaking terms with their family, that there isn't, maybe they work alone, or, that they're just surrounded by people they are not complimentary towards. Everybody's, I'm laughing because my husband bought me a book a few months ago that I still haven't read, but it stares at me in the bathroom every day, called Surrounded by Idiots. And, this would be a kind of person who would say, I'm surrounded by idiots.
So they're all kind of narcissistic then too. I think the malignant narcissist sociopath thing. And yet I find all your characters, maybe this says more about me, and the books are a little bit of a Rorschach test, as many thrillers. I find that the anti-heroes very charming in some ways. And I watch from inside, because we're always inside them looking out in the books, but you can see how from the outside there's a sort of, it's not just a lie that they're telling in words, but they have a sort of created personality, a crafted personality. Yeah. Did you, with your peas and carrots at that dinner table, ingest the connection between sociopathy and charm?
Yeah, charm was frequently discussed. I mean, charm. I mean, I, as I'm sure you did as well, I read all of those big fat serial murder books in the 1970s. I knew my Ted Bundy. I knew my Green River Murder. Charm in Bundy's case was his greatest weapon and the biggest agent of harm for his victims. I mean, he was a good-looking, charming man. And I just want to cite Jessica Knoll's novel, Bright Young Women, because that quote derives from something the judge said when he sentenced Bundy to death. He's sentencing this man to death. But before he does, he says, "You're a bright young man. And I wish you had, appeared in my courtroom in other circumstances," because Bundy, of course, was studying to be a lawyer when he was simultaneously killing people. And the fact that in spite of the horrendous crimes that the man had done, that his charm was still so visceral that the judge would take time out of sentencing him to death to acknowledge his potential is so disgusting and so telling. And I'm really very, I was really very impressed by that novel, Bright Young Women, and how she took that phrase and said, basically, what about the women that he killed? They were also bright young women, and they did not deserve what happened to them. So
this is what I'm giving to myself for the holidays. This book, Jessica Knoll, right? Bright Young Women.
Right.
Our producer, Karen, our wonderful producer, maybe we'll pop that link into the chat. I have done a great deal of thinking about charm in the past year, especially since I read the plot. I will confess that, and you know this because we spoke on the phone about this, but after I read the plot, I'm like, Jean can write about writing, I can write about writing. And it made me think about the pantheon of writers who I love, who write about writing and the writing life. And I always felt that I wasn't permitted to do that, and I'm not really sure why. But
that is interesting. Yeah, no, I always felt permitted, and I read all those books too. In fact, if I'm at the bookstore and I turn it over and it says a novelist, and I'm buying that book.
Yeah, totally. Actually, so I was going to talk about sociopathy and charm, but we may have covered that. I was just thinking
you did that.
Created a sociopath, and he's so charming, and I loved writing that person. And so I wanted to ask if you love writing your bad people, because you're not actually a bad person, but there's well, right. I mean, you could murder me and everybody would think I just had a bad cold or something, because you're very charming about it. What are your favorite books about writers?
Oh, what a good question. I think of the books that I've read that kind of put a finger on the, the great pain of writing and the pleasure of writing. Okay, I loved John Colapinto's novel About the Author, which also deals with plagiarism. Technically, the plot is not about plagiarism, but it is about the kind of gray area between who gets to write an idea, to whom does an idea belong? And I've always been fascinated with the way ideas bounce around, not just between writers, but in all the creative arts. I mean, the classic example being Homer's Odyssey, which becomes Ulysses, which becomes Cold Mountain. I just saw a one-man musical in which a man is basically trying to get to his own front door, and it takes him 10 years to get there. I mean, that too is an interpretation of the Odyssey. I mean, and there have been so many more. So that I loved. The pain of writing was I think never more powerfully articulated than in Martin Amis's novel, The Information. I mean, people have said, oh, the plot is the great novel of literary failure. It is not. Martin Amis's novel, The Information, is the great novel of literary failure. I also have to cite the 19th century novel Grub Street, whose author has just flown out of my mind. So maybe when Karen puts it up there, she can look up the author too. But Grub Street is about a Victorian writer just desperately trying to write his way out of poverty. And you know what? He can't do it. So that's a reminder to all of us that there have always been hardworking, well-meaning, talented writers who didn't make it. Most of us don't starve and freeze to death as a result, luckily, but in that case, I can't actually remember the end of the novel, but I remember the absolute feeling of suffering that went along with that literary career. So there you go. That's 3.
That was beautiful. And again, going in everybody's holiday lists, I hope if you know a writer or you're interested in writing about writing, then grab them. And I taught for over 20 years at a school called Grub Street here in Boston. That was after that novel, and people would ask, and then I was like, I actually don't want to tell you what the school's named for, because it's named after a hack who never made it. And meanwhile, it's this very robust, thriving writing community. I love the disenchanted. My list is not as erudite as your list. I think like the literal actual pain of writing, my favorite book is about writing is Misery by Stephen King.
Oh, sure. How could one forget? How could one forget? Yeah.
Every time I have writer's block, I read that book because it has this beautiful, very mechanistic description of how people get their ideas and then how those ideas are born out. And if you're lucky, nobody's literally standing over you doing terrible things to your actual physical body. But I think, well, what do I have to worry about? I'm just sitting here wringing my hands in my apartment and then going on social media. Like, so I feel a little bit better. But I think that your books about writing gave me the courage to attempt it because they're just so smart and they're so funny. And I thought, well, you don't have to be this like, you can be both smart and entertaining at the same time. And both the plot and the sequel are such great examples of that. And they're so delicious. They're just delicious. You guys, you have to buy these. You have to buy both of them, both of the books, both. All right, I'm going to talk about sequeling a little bit. I'm going to read to you your own words, if you don't mind, because there's a great passage.
I know exactly what you're going to read, so go ahead.
You know it, I know it, right? It's like one of the salient sort of nudge winks of the book for the reader, but this is a scene in which Anna, who Jean mentioned, so I'm not giving anything away, the hero of this book is talking with her agent at lunch. You knew this, right? This is what I was going to read. And has written her own book. And the agent says, who knows which direction you'll go? You could even continue with this character. She's captivating you now. Anna frowned. You mean like a sequel? Is that really a good idea? Sequels can be very enticing when the initial book has done well. Readers want to know what happens to a character they've connected with. But they're never as good as the first book, are they? Matilda seemed to give this real consideration. I'm sure some are, or at least as good. There was a pause as each of them tried to come up with an example of it. And I'll leave it there, although I was going to read the whole page, but I will spare you my reading. But it's this great sort of snort laugh passage for me when they're both trying to figure out, like, you know, who actually wrote a better sequel than the first book. And one of them says Harper Lee, who, you know, so famously wrote one book until Go Set a Watchman, which I personally am convinced was actually the rough draft of To Kill a Mockingbird pulled inside out like a pocket, but we can have a whole another conversation about that. So one of the things that I loved about this passage is one of the things that I love about both of these books is that they are sort of metafiction-y, like they are these nudge winky sort of devices about like the publishing and putting yourself in the book. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that specifically, like writing a sequel is a heavy lift for a writer, I think, right?
In some ways, it's a very heavy lift, and in some ways, it's easier. I mean, I'm not reinventing this reality. These are characters who already exist. I know what they look like. I know what they sound like. I know what their backstory is. So I don't have to start from zero with them. On the other hand, I have to color within the lines that I have already drawn. And that is a huge handicap for anyone writing, a novel. One of the great things about a novel is we are the gods and we can make the universe we want. I was once present at a conversation with Min-Jin Lee about her first novel, Free Food for Millionaires, when somebody in the group questioned a decision that Lee had made about a character who works in a dry cleaner in Queens and yet happens to have a world-class operatic voice. And, they said, how realistic is that? And Min-Jin basically said, this is my world and I control it. And if I want this woman to be, Maria Callas working in a dry cleaner in Queens, that is my prerogative. It's like, hell yeah. But you don't have that with the sequel because you cannot, as Misery, as the main character in Misery, the Annie, right, says, you cannot go back and, change how close the train is to our heroine who's tied up on the train tracks to give them more time for the hero to come and free her. You have given us a reality and you cannot change it. So I had to operate within the boundaries I had set at a time when I did not know I would ever write a sequel. That meant that I had to make use of every speck of useful information that was left to me from the plot. And you'd think There was a lot, but there wasn't. For example, I mentioned a piece of furniture in the plot without ever thinking that it was important. I had to make it important in the sequel because it was one of the very few things I had on which to anchor a storyline. I know that's a very obscure and obtuse thing to say, but I don't want to ruin it for you. So I really, in a way, it directed how the sequel went because I couldn't start just bringing in a lot of new characters. I had to be returning to the world that I had already made.
Yeah, it's not like you can have like a tree grow up in the middle of a house suddenly. You have to take advantage of what is already in that very vivid house.
That's right.
Yeah. That's right. You said it was like, it must be nice not to start from scratch in some ways. Were you sort of like, I picture you evilly cackling while you're writing both of these books, because that's what I like to do when I'm writing like suspense or evil characters. I literally cackle.
You're a cackler?
I'm a cackler. Yeah.
I'm going to file that under your name. She's a cackler. And I'm not a cackler.
Yeah, my neighbors love me. They're like, oh yeah, she's working on that thriller again. But did you like have some evil cackles while you were returning to the world of this book?
I mean, my primary emotion is at all times fear. I mean, I'm always terrified that things are going to go horribly wrong. In this case, I felt, for the first time in my career, I felt a lot of pressure because a lot of people had read the plot and they had opinions about it. And they wanted to see a sequel. I mean, I've never felt such a kind of surge of interest for any book I've ever written. But there was a lot of pressure that went along with it. So my main emotion with this one, as with everyone, is, oh my God, am I going to pull this off? People are going to be disappointed. That's one reason I put that passage in, just to sort of say, I know that usually the sequel isn't as good and it's never better, but I'm working hard here and I'm really trying to do the best that I can.
I think that's true. Sometimes I think the sequels are better, actually, or sometimes they are just as beloved. I usually think that about movies, but they all seem necessary. And I was so like, how I was like pestering you as soon as I even saw that the sequel was a glimmer in your eye. I was like, I need the arc. I need the arc. I need to know what happened. I need to know what the continuation of the story is. I was wondering about the reception of both the plot and the sequel. The sequel's been out for a couple of months now. I forgot what month it actually is, but
October. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. So
I've been really gratified. I mean, I really was braced for something quite different. I try not to spend a lot of time on Goodreads and Amazon, but the gist is love it as much, occasionally love it even more. Have there been a few people who said it wasn't as good as the first one? Of course. But on the whole, it's been really great. And then, the New York Times actually said something about it. It's even better. So that's, that went a long way to making me feel really good about it.
I hope people actually are afraid to review you because then they think they're going to end up in another. Like when I was coming up with my interview questions, I realized that I sounded just like the fatuous interviewers in both of these.
No, you don't.
Tell me about your process. I don't
know. Where do you get your ideas and what's your writing process? I mean, can't you just like, here's a stamp. I'm just going to stamp it on the screen and then I don't have to say it again. I do not have a writing process, and I am eternally grateful to Stephen King for many things, but more than anything is the gift that he gave us when he answered this question by saying, Utica, New York. Okay, where do you get your ideas? Utica, New York. I get them in Utica, New York, and that's the answer, and it is the perfect answer, and now we're going to move on.
That is a great idea. And if you've ever driven through Utica in the winter, you can understand why Stephen King gets.
Well, actually, we have a house here, not too far from Utica, where I wrote the plot. And every time I'm on the highway up there and I pass Utica or the sign for Utica, I take a picture and I send it to all my writer friends and I say, getting new ideas.
I love that. I hope you send it to Stephen King. I hope he writes back to you.
I came so close to meeting Stephen King 3 weeks ago at the Miami Book Fair. I've been, emailing with him. I went to watch him play in the Rock Bottom Remainders, but at the end of the day, I just could not push my way into the the backstage area. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I still have never actually met Stephen.
We could go on a little road trip and try and stalk him up in Maine, because I think the line like, I'm a writer too would work really well for Stephen King. I'm your number one fan.
I'm your number one fan. That'll work great.
Number one fan.
I am famously or infamously a non-blurber, and I have felt this way about blurbing, and I respect people who blurb, especially ones who teach. I'm not a teacher. I try to do other things to be a good literary citizen, like do Book the Writer, but I am not a blurber. First of all, even if I wanted to be a blurber, I wouldn't have time to be a blurber. There's just too much that I need to read. And when the plot came out, I had an epic battle with my editor and my agent about blurbs. And I thought about it, and I came back and I said, these are my criteria. I have two criteria. I can't know the person, and I have to genuinely admire the work. And there were 3 people on that list. And we sent the plot to those 3 people. One of them said no, which I respect, also a non-blurber. And the other 2 sent beautiful quotes, and one of them was Stephen King. And the day that arrived, I fell on the floor, and I'm still on the floor, because what he wrote was so. I mean, he was reading the plot as a writer, and he felt the pain of that character. Because it doesn't matter if you're Stephen King or if you the guy in Grub Street, you feel like a failure. You just do.
Yeah, with some books you actually do fail too, then fail better, right? That's the Beckett quote. The plot is one of the best novels I've ever read about writers and writing. That's not me, that's Stephen King. It's also insanely readable, and the suspense quotient is through the roof. It is remarkable. Co-sign. Heartily agree with my friend Stephen, who we're gonna stalk. And I know you guys all know this out there, but the blurbs are the quotes for the back jacket, and every author quails when it comes to asking for blurbs. It's a necessary evil. We all have to do it, which then leads to a lot of stalking and groveling and the sending of chocolates and puppies and
well, nobody ever gave me a puppy, but no, right. I really feel that if a cloud descended on all of publishing and then lifted and took all the blurbs with it, and we had to go back to the old way of putting a quote from the book on the back of the cover, or maybe some reviews of previous books, that would be better for all of us. But that is not going to happen. So like I said, there are other ways to be a good literary citizen. But in the words of Meatloaf, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. So,
all right. Meanwhile, I'm making a mental note, like send Jean a puppy when I need blurb for next book. It's
No puppies, please.
A parrot? All right. I won't do any of those things. I have many more questions. I'll ask 2 more, and then I want you guys to think about the questions you always wanted to ask Jean and never were able to. We've got here captive for a few more minutes. One of my questions is, which is more fun to write about in these books, the writing life or the thriller aspect?
I would say the writing life, because with writing suspense, I mean, it's a heavy lift, because, we're all intelligent readers of suspense. And I'm sure many people read plot-driven novels the way I do, which is to try to, set ourselves against the author and see where it's going before the author tells us. And often I can see where it's going, and then I'm disappointed. So I know those people are reading me, and I don't want to disappoint them, and I don't want to cheat the way the character in Misery informs the author in that novel of all the different ways that authors cheat. She's right. She's absolutely right. We are not allowed to cheat. We are not allowed to bring in a new character at the last minute. We are not allowed to say somebody was in a dream state, a fugue state, while they committed crimes and therefore has no knowledge of them. We're not allowed to have somebody's identical twin or long lost cousin or, schizophrenic murderer who has no idea that his alternate personality is committing crimes. These are all file under cheating, it has to feel inevitable, and it has to be surprising at the same time. And if you think that's a tough one, you bet. And that is why there are so few books that really, really do it for us. And, where we felt really, really surprised. And, I got to give a shout out to Scott Giroux here, because he is amazingly good at that. And, Presumed Innocent was so shocking to me that I didn't see it coming. And, I still don't see it coming, even though they kind of changed it in the most recent adaptation, which we will not discuss.
I'm going to ask you, like, this is a bounce off question, but other thrillers that you love? I'm quailing just thinking about this. I just wrote a thriller and I'm like, oh, wait, I can't do that actually. But
no, you can't. Well, I mean, you can do whatever you want, but think about the number of books that we've read. If you're like me, and I know you are, you read books all the time. You read hundreds and thousands of books. Now think about the ones that blew you away, that truly surprised you, that left you, gobsmacked is a great word for this. You just stunned at how good they were. 5, 10, thousands of books, 5 and 10 did that to you. That doesn't mean the other books were bad. It just means that our passion and our admiration and our, the excitement with which we talk about a book is reserved for actually very few of them. And, I have my people, and I read a lot of books. I enjoy a lot of them, but the excitement, the passion, the beating heart, that is restricted to a very small number.
That is totally true. I was just thinking, I just finished reading the new Jennifer Hay book, which is out in April. It's called Rabbit Moon, and that is not a thriller. It's not suspense, and yet she performed like something in that book that shocked me. That was so surprising to me. Like, I get this from, quote, literary fiction too, the non-genre fiction. A lot of the times, they startle me, and then I always remember that, and sometimes feel like kind of sad about it. So, how do you construct these plots that you hope are going to pull off these sort of zygotic twists?
Yeah. Well, I can't answer that, because what I'm doing is not constructing. In a weird way, it's the opposite of constructing. What I'm doing is gradually removing possibilities of things that can happen because they're too obvious, because they're cheating, because they're not interesting enough, and just hoping that when you're finished removing all those things, there will be something that you didn't see. And it works. And by some writer's alchemy that I don't understand, that has always been the case.
That's great. It's like more like taking things off the table than setting the table.
Exactly.
The last object on the table is like a foot or something.
That's right. And there's a foot on the table. Yeah, no, it's like that. And it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like, you're moving down a long corridor, and as you go down the corridor, doors are shutting as you go past them, and you're thinking, so what is going to happen? How do I get out of this? And somehow that last door, the one you didn't see, is the door that has the right answer behind it. And it is not, and this is why I don't teach, because I don't know how to describe that. I don't know if it's true for you. I don't know if it's going to be true for me next time. I mean, this is why writing is so scary, to me anyway. And, but somehow if I get that far down the corridor, there has always been something surprising at the end. I didn't know when I wrote the sequel how it was going to end. I didn't know. I didn't know where our protagonist was going to be. I didn't know, was our protagonist going to be a living person? I mean, I just did not know. And then I would say about 20 pages before the end, I really saw what would happen. Yeah.
And were you like, oh, thank God? Like, what if you get to the end and there's no door and you get to back all the way out?
I was relieved. Yeah, I was relieved. Because you just don't want to disappoint.
No, you never want to disappoint, ever. I mean, you can write a career of 10 books, 20 books, 50 books. And I feel like if you're lucky, 1 or 2 of those will be classics or masterpieces. maybe the bulk of them will be competent, and then one or two of them are just going to be like, you know, I mean, and that's just the way it goes. But you always aspire not only not to disappoint, but to dazzle your readers and take them out of their lives for a little bit, right? I mean, this way.
I mean, even the great Jane Austen, the great Jane Austen, I wouldn't put Northanger Abbey in the same category as Pride and Prejudice. And those two books were written more or less at the same time. So, I mean, what she could accomplish by the end of her short writing life was on a different level than the wonderful stuff that she did at the beginning of her writing life. So, I mean, and that's Jane Austen, the greatest of the great. So, yeah.
Well, we just try.
We try hard. Do our best.
Yeah. Okay. I have one more question, then we have some audience questions, and then I will eventually release you into the world out of my own corridor of evil. One of my favorite scenes in the sequel is of the main character in a signing line. And again, it's like the verisimilitude of the writing life that I love so much about these books, in addition to their diabolical plots. And people are coming up to her talking about something that happens in her book. And it's a really high voltage topic, and it exhausts her because people are in the line telling her their own stories. I think most writers in a signing line become a kind of lightning bolt for the reader's experience. It's a great honor, and it's very humbling, and it is totally exhausting. So I'm wondering, in your signing lines for any of your books, has anybody said something to you that you remember, like a story where you were like, whoa, I was not expecting that, and then you had to go back to your hotel and have a giant whiskey?
Great question. Didn't see that going the way that you went. I thought you were going to ask me, like, are people afraid to come out to me in signing lines now? And some people have said, I was kind of afraid to meet you because of what you wrote about signing lines. Well, actually, one thing that I did write about signing lines in the sequel is how, you know, this character, Anna, she has these long lines, and sometimes she's doing an event with another person and there's nobody there, and she almost feels sorry for that person. Well, I did two recent literary festivals where I was paired with very, very well-known writers. And I will say that I was on the short end of those signing lines. And I just decided I can sit here and look like, you know, an idiot and feel sorry for myself, or I can just get up and go down these lines and just say, hey, do you have anything for me to sign? And I did that. It was a little way to kind of relieve the embarrassment of being that person. But yeah, something happened about a month ago in Charleston where a woman introduced herself. She was the sister of a boy that I had dated many, many years ago who died very young, and who became not just the inspiration for a character in my novel, The Latecomer, but the accident in which this young man died was the kind of foundational event of The Latecomer. If you've read The Latecomer, you know that it begins with a terrible car accident in which two people die, and the novel then goes on to be about the person who was driving the car in that accident. And this was somebody I never expected to meet, let alone see that day in Charleston, and that was just a transformative conversation. So that was pretty much the most shocking thing that's happened. But there is a lot of Me Too that goes on, and especially with The Latecomer, because The Latecomer had so many things that it was about. I mean, you could say The Latecomer was about 25 different things, and they'd all be correct. And there was a lot that people were relating to in that story. So on the other hand, with the plot, you know, I expected to get a lot more grief from a lot more writers, and I didn't. I mean, I think one person wrote on Goodreads, you know, I feel really offended by this book. You know, the way she writes about writers was deeply offensive to me. And when I read that, I thought, you're damn straight. I mean, where are the rest of you offended writers? I would be an offended writer. I don't know if it's part of our craziness that we don't see ourselves as the kind of desperate writer that Jake, the protagonist of the plot, saw himself as, or his students who were also desperate in a different way. So I don't know if that's part of the warped, hall of mirrors in our minds. But yeah.
Maybe. I mean, I kind of snickered in recognition in both books about so many aspects of the writing life. And I think there's something a little bit suspect about writing fiction anyway. If you're not writing autobiography, straight memoir, which in itself is a little bit of a fiction. But if you're writing fiction, you're borrowing from somewhere, and we know there's something like a weensy bit, probably odious or suspect about it. So it's kind of like, the book is giving us our spankings. Both the books are. And we're like, okay, yep, fair. All right. And yet we're still going to keep trying to strive to bring people good stories and do this thing that
because we love stories and we love language. That's our jam. That's what we do. I have a friend who went into theater, and his father never understood this, and he said, "You tell lies in the dark for money," which is absolutely true. That's what theater is, and it's also what literature is. Fiction is. We tell lies on the page for money. I mean, if you come right down to it, if we're lucky to be paid by somebody to do this, but that's what we're doing.
Right. And also, I mean, the books are sort of like loving indictments of the industry as well. So it's not just like the writers are all, freaky, although we are all a little bit freaky, I have to say. But I mean, the industry itself, also that nexus of art and commerce, that again could be a whole nother interview. Okay. So Karen, I know we have some questions from very patient audience members. I could sit and talk about this stuff all day. I shan't. Can you talk about your career trajectory? What is it like to go from a debut to such enormous success in hard times? How did you keep going?
Okay, this is, I'm going to try to keep this short because it's, I could talk about it for as long as the career that I've had, which is long. And one of the reasons I can write about this stuff is that I've been around long enough to have seen everything. When I was working on my very first 2 novels, which were never published, my contemporaries, it seemed to me, were sailing into print. I mean, Jay McInerney, Bret Easton Ellis, these are my contemporaries. And, it took me 7 novels before anybody was paying attention. And that's despite the fact that one of them, Admission, had already been made into a film. So I take a lot of responsibility for that because I couldn't stick to a genre. I kept flipping over back and forth across the literary thriller line, and that has implications for readers and a lot of implications for publishing. So the first novel I managed to publish was a suspense novel, and that meant that I really wasn't taken seriously as a literary novelist ever, which is why the reception of The Latecomer was so meaningful to me. It was a very powerful moment for me that I was being taken seriously as a literary novelist. What I had discovered along the way was that I love plot. I love being surprised by a story. It doesn't happen very often, as I said. That it happens in a book like Presumed Innocent, which happens to be extraordinarily beautifully written, is as meaningful to me as, Jane Austen or Dickens or any of the greats whom I sincerely love. So it took so long because I got better at it, I think, but also I was lucky because I had an incredible agent and an incredible editor after book number 4 who really stuck with me and believed that I would get there. And I mean, that doesn't mean that every book that they published for me got readers. It didn't. I mean, the Devil and Webster, 6 people read that book. Not many people read Admission. Not many people read You Should Have Known, which became The Undoing. So really, when the plot came out, everything felt different. And I thought, I don't know if it's because of Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant, because that had just been on, and this was the first book to come out after that. But it just felt, the earth was rumbling under that book, and it really connected. So I am so grateful to have readers now. And I'm so grateful that they're discovering my backlist, because those books haven't changed a word. They're still on the shelf exactly as I wrote them. Still proud of them. maybe not the first one. You can let the first one go unread, but yeah, it's been an incredible, long road to get here.
That's really inspiring. To keep going and have a good team is the advice I'm wringing from that.
The only part you can control is the keep going part. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have the great team and they can stick with you, then I mean, that's just beyond anybody's, anything you could wish for. But, your responsibility is the one that's always been right in front of you, which is to write the next book and make it as good as you can. And that's hard enough without getting into all the stuff you can't control.
It is. Yeah. You can't think about anything else. We had Peter Heller on the Blaze a couple of times, and he said his only advice that he got from a mentor is just write something that doesn't suck. And that's what keeps him going every day. That is hard enough, right?
Sure.
For all of us. Okay. One more question. Karen's choice. What writing advice would you give to your younger self? I think maybe I just gave it, but maybe not. Work hard and have a good team. Who knows?
I can tell you the advice I would give to not my younger self, but anybody who asked, and especially young people. And I do read a lot of work by young people, and I recognize their anxiety. They want to know if they're good. I wanted to know if I was good when I was a teenager, but if I were telling myself that now, I would say that's the wrong question. And in fact, writing as a young person, I mean, it's great. Do it all you want. Do it as much as you can. But in my mind, it is not nearly as important as reading. We are asking to enter a tradition that existed long before us, and we hope will continue long after us. It is our responsibility to understand that tradition. That is going to take that's going to take your whole life, basically. Maybe you're an English major and you get a little bit of a head start. Maybe you're reading, Grub Street in school, but if you're not, you still have to read it. You have to read Jane Austen. You have to read Sidney Sheldon. You have to read Judith Krantz. I mean, I'm not an elitist. I read every Judith Krantz novel. I read every Sidney Sheldon novel. I mean, I love stories. One of my favorite novels of all time is by Frederick Forsyth. Nobody would consider him a literary novelist, but it's part of my personal pantheon of great novels. So my advice is absolutely right, but make sure that you understand the world you are hoping to enter.
Beautiful. See, you are a teacher.
But I can't teach anyone how to do it. I mean, nobody taught me how to do it, and I don't know. I don't know. I really respect people who can do it, and I just who can teach it, and I just don't think I'm one of them.
Well, I will beg to differ with you. I think you have taught us a lot in this conversation. Notice my graceful pivot there, but we're finally going to let you go so you can enjoy your evening. We could talk to you all night. Thank you again. Everybody go out and buy the sequel. If you haven't read the plot yet, you're like the only person in the world who has. You should buy them together and give them to people you love for this holiday season. I love these books so much. Jean, thank you so much for being with us. I know you have a jillion things to do. Thank you for spending the time. Happy holidays, everybody. Happy reading. See you next time on Blaze.